Welcome back once again to the Imaginary Gallery. It's TJ, your host, and we are discussing recognizing covert abuse. And we're referencing Lundy Bancroft's lovely book, Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. We are covering the mythology of this abuse. Myth number 9 is he hates women. His mama or some other lady must have done something awful to him. The idea that abusive men hate women was popularized by Susan Forward's books, Men Who Hate Women and the Women Who Love Them. Dr. Forward's descriptions of abusive men are the most accurate ones that this author has ever read. But he claims that she was mistaken on one point. Most abusers, he tells us, do not hate women. In fact, many times they have close relationships with their mamas or their sisters or their lady friends. And a lot of these are able to work successfully with a female boss and also respect her authority, at least on an outward basis. Disrespect for women certainly is common among abusive men, with attitudes towards ladies that fall on a continuum from those who can interact fairly constructively with most ladies as long as they're not intimately involved with them, to men who are misogynists and treat most women they encounter with superiority and contempt. In general, the author finds that his clients view that their partners should cater to their needs and are not worthy of being taken seriously. This does carry over into how they view other ladies, including their own daughters. But, as we will see in a later chapter, the disrespect that abusive men so often direct towards females in general tends to be born of their cultural values and conditioning rather than personal experiences of being victimized by ladies. Some abusive men use the excuse that their behavior is a response to such victimization because they want to be able to make these ladies responsible for men's abuse. It's important to note that research has shown us that men who had abusive mothers do not tend to develop especially negative attitudes towards the female gender, but men who have abusive fathers do. The disrespect that abusive men show their female partners and their daughters is many times observed by their sons. So, while a small amount of abusive men do actually hate women, the larger majority exhibit a more subtle, though often quite pervasive, sense of superiority or contempt towards ladies. Some don't show any obvious signs of problems with ladies at all. That is, of course, until they're in an intimate relationship or serious relationship with one. Now, myth number 10. He's afraid of intimacy and he's afraid of abandonment. Abusive men are often jealous and very possessive, and their coercive and destructive behaviors may escalate when their partners attempt to leave them. Some psychologists have glanced quickly at this pattern and come to the conclusion that abusive people have an extreme fear of abandonment. But many people, both males and females, are afraid of abandonment, and many reel from panic, desperation from being left by a partner, or heartbreak. If a person's panicked reaction to being left could cause threat, stalking, or murder, the society we live in would be a war zone. But post-separation homicides of intimate partners are committed almost exclusively by men, and there's almost always a history of some kind of abuse before the breakup. If fear of abandonment causes post-separation abuse, our author's asking us, why are their statistics so lap-sided? Do females have a much easier time with abandonment than guys? No, of course not. A close cousin of the abandonment myth is the belief that abusive men are afraid of intimacy, which attempts to explain why most abusers mistreat only their partners and why most of them are male. According to this theory, the abusive person uses his periodic cruelty to keep the partner from getting too close to him emotionally, which is a behavior in the language of psychologists is called mediating the intimacy. But he says there are several holes in this theory. Number one hole is that abusive men usually have the worst incidents after a period of mourning, but there are several holes, the author says, in this theory. Number one hole, abusive men usually have their worst incidents after a period of mounting tension and distance, not at the moments of greatest closeness. Some keep their emotional distance all the time, so the relationship never gets close enough to trigger any kind of fears of intimacy they may have, yet the abuse continues. Spousal abuse occurs just as severely in some cultures where there is no expectation of intimacy between husband and wife, where marriage has nothing to do with real emotional connections. And lastly, there are plenty of males who have powerful fears of intimacy who do not abuse or try to control their partners because they don't have an abusive mentality. On to myth number 11. He suffers from low self-esteem. He needs his self-image to be improved. Then the author goes into a question, number 3, which is it because he feels badly about himself? An abused lady tends to pour precious energy into supporting her abusive partner and massaging his ego, hoping against all hope that if he is kept well stroked, his next explosion may be averted. How well does this strategy actually work? Unfortunately, not very well. You cannot manage an abuser except for in brief periods of time. Praising the abuser and boosting self-esteem may buy you a little bit of time, but sooner or later he'll jump back into chewing pieces out of your flesh. When you try to improve the abusive person's feelings about him or herself, problem usually tends to get worse. An abusive man expects catering, and the more positive attention received, the more is demanded. He never reaches a point where there's satisfaction, where he's been given enough, and eventually the demands will become escalated. Now, the colleagues of this author and himself discovered this dynamic through a mistake they made in the very early years of abuse work. A few times they asked clients who had made outstanding progress in the program to be interviewed on television or to speak to a group of high school kids because they thought the public could benefit from hearing an abusive person speak in its own words about the behaviors and process of the change. Unfortunately, though, they found that each time they gave a client public attention, this client had a bad incident of mistreating his partner within a few days afterwards. Feeling like a star, his head swelled from all the attention he was getting. He would go home and rip into the partner with accusations and insults, so he had to stop taking their clients to public appearances. Now, the self-esteem myth is rewarding for an abusive person because it gets its partner, therapist, and others to cater to him emotionally. Imagine the privileges that an abusive person may acquire. Getting his way, most of the time, having the partner bend over backwards to make sure he is happy so he won't explode, getting to behave as he wishes, and everybody's trying to help him to feel better about himself. Now, certainly, an abusive person can be remorseful or ashamed after being evil or spooky to his partner, especially if any kind of outsider was there to see what he has done. But those feelings are a result of his abusive behavior, not a cause. And as a relationship progresses, the abusive partner tends to get more comfortable with his or her own behavior, and the remorse just dies out, becomes suffocated under the heavy weight of his excuses or justification. He may become nasty, Miss Jackson, if he doesn't receive the frequent compliments, flattery, reassurance, and deference he feels he's entitled to. But this reaction is not rooted in feelings of inferiority. In fact, the reality is almost the opposite. Lundy Bancroft tells us, we will see. He says to think for just a moment about how your partner's evil, degrading, bullying behavior has hurt your sense of self-esteem. Have you suddenly turned into a cruel and explosive person? If low self-esteem isn't an excuse for you to become abusive, well, then it ain't one excuse for him either. On to myth number 12. His boss abuses him, so he feels powerless and unsuccessful. He comes home every night and takes it out on the family because that's the one place he actually can feel powerful. Now, the author calls this myth, boss abuses man, man abuses lady, lady abuses children, children hit the dog, dog bites the cat, tuna fish eats the rat. Hundreds of his clients have been popular, good-looking, successful men, not the downtrodden looking for a scapegoat for their inner torment. Some of the worst abusers he's worked with have been at the top of the management ladder, with no bosses to blame. The more power these people have in their jobs, the more catering and submission they expect to receive in their homes. So while some abusive people use the mean boss excuse, others use the opposite. The most important point is this one. In Lundy Bancroft's 15 years in the field of abuse, he has never once had a client whose behavior at home improved because the person's job situation improved. Moving along quickly to myth number 13, he has got poor communication, conflict resolution, and stress management skills. He just needs some training. Now, he tells us that an abusive man is not unable to resolve conflicts non-abusively. He is unwilling to do so. The skill deficits of abusers have been the subject of many research studies, and the results lead to this conclusion. Abusive people have normal abilities in conflict resolution, communication, and assertiveness when they choose to use them. Typically, they get through tense situations at work without threatening anybody. They manage their stress without exploding when they spend their Thanksgiving celebration with their parents. They share openly with their brothers and sisters regarding their sadness over a grandparent's death, but they don't want to handle these kinds of issues non-abusively when the partner's involved. You can equip an abuser with the most innovative New Age skills for expressing his deep emotions, listening actively, and using win-win bargaining, and he will go home and continue abusing. In a later chapter, we'll see why this is. And this will be the last one for this video, myth number 14. There are just as many abusive ladies as there are abusive men. Abused men are invisible because they're ashamed to tell. There certainly are some ladies who treat their male partners terribly, berating them and calling names, attempting to control them, which is an arena his clients win hands down over their partners, just as they do in a violent altercation. Who can beat an abuser at its own game? Men can be abused by other men. Ladies can be abused by other ladies, sometimes through means that include physical intimidation or violence. If you are a queer man, a lesbian who's been abused by a partner or who's facing abuse now, most of what Lundy explains in this book, which I've tried to switch around somewhat, will ring loud bells for you. The he and she language that he uses, and I've used some, obviously won't fit your exact experience, but it doesn't matter. The underlying dynamics that he describes largely will.
I know when I read your old emails, I saved them, by the way. Oh, but not for sentimental reasons. I saved them because you seem to be a real person, which I know that I ain't. I'm just boobs and heels. So I kept your emails, I studied them, and in my future targets, I tried to quote several of them, which met with mixed results. I guess I don't get where you come up with some of the stuff you say, but regardless, I saved all of your old emails and tried to use the lines you used to pass myself off as a real person to some of my other targets, and it didn't always work. That's because they were stupid, though. It's just because they're dumb. Nothing to do with me.
I am the narcopath, and I think I'm going to change my name again. My new name's gonna be Lola Lust, and I'm gonna start that escort service I've always dreamed about. Before you know it, I'll be in your town, advertising my parts for sale. Look out for it.
Lola Lust, Lola Lust. Lola Lust, lost in the dust. It's the escort service you can trust. Lola Lust, lost in the dust. It's the escort service you can trust.
Hi, I'm Lola Lust. Lust in the Dust Escorts is the one-stop shop for all of your wildest desires. Whether it's male, female, or she-male, we've got what you want. Give us a call. Do it now.
Lola Lust is your escort service. Don't be shy.